Who did sin that this poor guy was born blind? Jesus rebukes him and says, no one sinned. God uses the bad that happens in our world to bring glory to himself. And in this case, he heals this blind person. He puts mud over the guy's eyes and he has to walk several miles by himself to a different pool to dip into the pool and be healed. Even his parents would not come clean and say that Jesus did this because they were afraid of persecution. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope this sermon will be helpful. But the point is very clear. If we get what we deserve, think about that theology. It's terrible theology. It ignores the fact that grace is available to everyone. Now, again, we get what we deserve. Oftentimes what happens, at least in my life, is I don't want to live with the consequences of my actions. I want to lay that off on something else. But sometimes when I do something dumb, I get this reaction that I deserve, and I'm going, wait a minute, I don't deserve this. Now, let me say this again. I have a very large bottle of dumb pills. I take them on a regular basis. I will do the wrong thing. That is my gift. I can do the wrong thing in a nanosecond. We never get what we deserve. If you look at the opposite implication of that, would be this. When good things happen to us, we must deserve those things. The entire book of Job, in my humble opinion, was written to refute the idea that we get what we deserve. Job certainly didn't deserve what happened to him. Can you imagine what he went through? He loses his family, he loses his possessions, he loses his house, he loses his children, and eventually his wife says, why don't you curse God and die? And then his friends turn on him as well. His friends are very, the self-righteous group. I don't know if you have any self-righteous friends at all, but Job did. And they say to Job, yeah, come on, tell us what's really going on behind the scenes so you can tell us. We won't tell anybody. You can reveal your flaw to us. And Job's confused. Now, what's interesting about that, I love the last chapter of the book of Job, and I love the fact, again, resurrection. In resurrection, we will have restored to us those things that we lost in this lifetime. Now, often we think, I've just been recently reading about this, and maybe I'm overly concerned about this at this point, but we often read about heaven and we think, somebody floating around on clouds, whatever. Heaven is not presented that way at all in the book of Revelation. Heaven is presented in the book of Revelation, chapters 21 and 22, as if heaven is on earth when the earth is restored to its pre-fall time. When you think about heaven, when I think about heaven, I try to envision in my own brain the Garden of Eden prior to the fall, because that's what we're going to get. Floating around, how motivated are you to live a life where you think heaven is floating around with Casper up in the clouds playing Kumbaya every Sunday, singing Kumbaya 24/7? That's not motivating at all to me. It's motivating to me to realize that when I pay a price for being faithful, God understands that, and whatever I've lost in this life will be restored in the next life. I'll come back to that when we do a series on that. We don't get what we deserve. The next thing that often they'll say is, and I've heard this so many times, what's in it for me? Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he said, wash in the pool of Siloam. This means sent. So that the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now it says he went. The text doesn't tell you how far he went. He went 3 to 5 miles walking blind. Now maybe he had a friend guiding him. We don't know. We also don't know how old this guy was, but we do know he was old enough to give an account for himself. Because later in this passage, His parents are asked about, is this really your son? Was he really born blind? Whatever. And they don't want to answer the question because they don't want to be persecuted. So they deflect that question and say, ask him, he's right here. It's not a bad approach to take anyway when you have a conversation about someone else's problem. Just ask that person. What's in it for me? Now let me offer, I think, a worldview I try to live by. I'm not always good at that at all. But I try to live my life living out what's best for the other person. And in doing that, I find a lot of joy. There's nothing to me more joyful than seeing people around me succeed in their struggles. I'm coaching a couple ministers now that have really having a hard time. But they're going to get through it. And they'll call me up and say, thank you for helping me. I find extreme joy in that, in helping people. What's in it for me? Well, let me offer this. What's in it for me is an opportunity to serve. And I will say this from the bottom of my heart. You will never have the joy that you want if you take life as what you can get. That's a drug that will never satisfy. It just won't satisfy. But if I'll approach life as what I can offer, what I can give, my life will have significant meaning. A couple fun story for me. I've shared part of this story before. I had a guy in my youth group who made a profession of faith in Christ right in the middle of the youth meeting. We were role playing, and all of a sudden I thought, this might be real. And I said, is this real? He said, it's real. He professed Christ right in front of all his peers in a youth meeting, 14 kids in the same room. Well, he started carrying his Bible to school. He's a football player, about my height, and he got pounded for that. He took more abuse for that than I probably have ever taken. And in his wisdom, he turned and handed one of the biggest bullies the Bible and said, if you think it's easy, you carry it for a while. And that stopped it right dead in its tracks. He won that whole group over by saying that. He became my youth minister at one of my churches. He went to seminary out in Kentucky. He's now serving a very large church in Roanoke, Virginia as a family minister. And I sit back and grin. Because I had a little bit of input into his journey. You'll never have the joy that you want, or we want, if you take life as what I can get. But if you take life as what I can give, your joy will be immeasurable. The next thing blindness does is, I've heard this many times too, I don't believe in miracles. I've had people say that to me. They brought to the Pharisees a man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes was on the Sabbath. Oh, God forbid. Jesus does something good on the Sabbath again. How can he possibly be so insensitive to their culture? To do something good on the Sabbath. And the point is, Jesus never broke the Sabbath. He just did not honor the wacky rules that the Pharisees in that day had set up for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, see, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a sinner do such miraculous things? So they were divided. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a sinner do such miraculous things? So they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man, and he said, what have you to say about him? Your eyes are open, the man replied. He's a prophet. At some point, this guy catches on. I'm not sure where exactly he got it, but he does. And the point being is, skeptics out there that we run into on a regular basis are going to pick you apart if you talk about your faith journey. That's just a fact. And a lot of times we stay silent because we don't want to hear it. People will take issue with you if you start talking about miracles and stuff. But it's interesting to me. Oh, by the way, a Microsoft MSN webpage pointed out this past week that the Atlantic Ocean is cooling at an unprecedented rate. But the gospel of global warming still reigns supreme. I don't know how you make those two things work out. But my point is, you don't have to talk about that stuff. But we talk about what is important and what matters. So a person who denies there are miracles, think about this, who says there are no miracles, will vehemently argue that evolution is true. And evolution, if it were true, in my humble opinion, would be a much bigger miracle than God creating it. What do I mean? How in the Sam Hill, and you can look up Sam Hill, his name is written somewhere in the books. I think he was a golf cart owner up in New England somewhere. How in the Sam Hill do we make sense of something coming from nothing? How do you make sense of, I might be wrong about my numbers here, it takes 14 amino acids to create one protein, and we have not been able to create a protein in the lab yet. But somehow, out of a bog somewhere, these chemicals somehow randomly align themselves to not just create a protein, but to create life. I don't have enough faith to believe that. That is a miracle, if it happened. How can that possibly be? I just think it's ludicrous to believe that. But the same people that say there are no miracles will tell you that that's what happened. Wow. And, I mentioned earlier, one of my sermons about if the world really were 6 billion years old or more, the Gulf of Mexico, they would farm in it because it'd be land, not water. Because the Mississippi River is dumping so much silt and dirt into the Gulf of Mexico, they know they can measure how much every year goes in there. If the world was 6 billion years old, it'd be farming land. If the world was 6 billion years old, I'm off track a little bit here about my sermon, but if the world was 6 billion years old, we know precisely, scientists know precisely about the salty salination of the oceans. They know how it happens, and they know the rate at which it happens. You're aware of that, right? They know that the rain goes through the mountains and the rocks, and it picks up all these molecules of stuff, and there's salt in there, and it deposits that salt in the ocean. They know that for a fact, and they know how much salt happens every year. If the world was 6 billion years old, you could drive your car from here to England and to Africa on the salt bed. But they don't believe in miracles. Back to my topic. Next thing blindness will say is, I don't talk about religion. Whew. You don't talk about religion. You don't talk about Christian religion. The fact of the matter is, there was a line of thought years ago. Believe it or not, the group of folks that had the greatest impact on John Wesley when he converted, when his heart was strangely warmed, were Moravians. You remember that, right? There were two branches of Moravians. One branch was run by a guy named Zinzendorf, and I draw a blank on the other branch. But one of those two branches, and I'm not sure which one it was, part of their theology said you don't talk even to your own children about faith because you want them to grow up and decide for themselves. I mean, you ever heard that stuff? Oh, we don't talk about faith. We want our kids to decide for themselves. How many of you ever said this? There are two things we don't talk about at our house. Politics and what? So we don't talk about religion. Why is that? Verse 21. But how he can see now, I don't know. Or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him, he's of age, he will speak for himself. They weren't ready to talk about religion either, because they were afraid they were going to get killed by the Pharisees if they talked about it. They were frightened. It says, his parents said because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. And that was why his parents said, he is of age, ask him yourself. Wow. The next thing that blindness does is more concerned. Pedigree's everything. And they attack Jesus by saying, wait a minute, we know about Moses. We know Moses. Who do you think you are? They hurled insults at him and said, you're this fellow's disciple. We're disciples of Moses. Wow, good for him. We know that God spoke to Moses. How do they know God spoke to Moses? And they're not willing to say that God, through Jesus, did this miracle, but they know God spoke to Moses. Doesn't that sound a little off to us today? They don't believe in miracles, so how can they say that Moses was spoken to by God? But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly and who does his will. Wow. They're prepared. Their pedigree's everything. Now, in talking about pedigree, let me say again, in ancient days, prior to 70 AD, if you walked up to a Jewish person on the street, they could outline their chronology, probably all the way back to Adam. They knew who begot who, but who begot who begot who begot who begot who, etc., etc., etc. After 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, those records were wiped out. They have no knowledge at all today of their pedigree. I think it's ironic, by the way, in sort of a John kind of way. I find it ironic that they put so much value in pedigree and genealogy and chronology and all this stuff, and that is one of the first things that happens in Jerusalem after Jesus is raised from the dead and departs. The temple's destroyed. Now they have no knowledge of their pedigree. Well, how dare you say I'm blind? This is how the skeptics react. How dare you say I'm blind? Jesus heard that they had thrown him out and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked, tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. This is probably the same guy who had his sight restored. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world so that now think about this, so that the blind will see and those who see will become blind. Now again, Jesus said this repeatedly in different ways. One of the ways he said it was, I didn't come for the sick. I didn't come for the well, I came for the sick. He's repeating that. And he's not saying I'm blinding people. He's just simply saying you're not going to believe. Now, for those in our culture who think that this is predestination or whatever they think it is, I would argue that it's not at all that. He's simply saying I'm observing something, and that is that the people who need a doctor will cry out to me and I will help them, and those who don't need a doctor are going to run from me. And that's what's going on here. Because they were content in their religious life, and Jesus is shaking them up pretty hard. Some Pharisees were with him, heard him say this, and asked, "What, are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now you claim you can see, your guilt remains." Just another way of saying what he just said. Well, here's some so what for us, if you will. So what? With God's help, what will I do? I will not be silent. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in to Horns Methodist Church today. I hope this sermon from John chapter 9 has been helpful. When we go through life's journey, we have all kinds of challenges to face. God can use those challenges to mature us, to help us grow in our faith, and to bring glory to Himself. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you have a great week. God bless.